What's up, WAP? Okay, so this is the second part of the Unit 3, Part 2 lecture. We are still talking about the era between 1450 to 1750, and this little small lecture is going to be on a major theme of this time period, which is the Protestant Reformation in Europe. The Catholic Church had dominated politics and religion in the previous time period. However, there are many reasons why the Catholic Church starts to lose power in this time period. For one, the Hundred Years' War. The Hundred Years' War was fought between England and France. And what happens as a result of the Hundred Years' War is that England and France start to identify as nation states of England and France. They speak English, they speak French, they follow a king. And because of this, no longer are they only united by the church. Now they're united by a common ancestry, a common language, etc. This is going to further weaken the church because the church previously it had the power of literacy, meaning it had the power to read the Bible, which was always written in Latin. But now with these new languages, these vernacular languages starting to emerge, we see people translating the Bible into their own languages and then no longer needing the church for this reason. The Catholic Church also starts to becoming known for corruption, especially monks that are supposed to be living lives of very simple lives devoted to worship, and yet because the church collected taxes, we saw the monks becoming quite wealthy and prominent, as well as the upper levels of the church, the bishops and the Pope, of course. Reforms had become unsuccessful at limiting the corruption of the church, and then the Black Death, which was obviously killing millions of people in Europe. Why would this terrible plague occur if the church was telling us that if you listen to what the church has to say, then God will not punish you? Well, certainly God punished Europe for all of with all these deaths occurring with the plague, and so this shows that there is obviously a disconnect between God's will and what the church is telling the people. And so the church is now vulnerable for kings to come in and rise above them in the social structure. And that's going to be caused largely by our first Protestants. One such person is John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was an Englishman. He taught at Oxford. And he was religious. He was religious. He believed in God, but he said that the church shouldn't be there to get rich. In fact, the church should aid people to live lives like Jesus Christ. And in fact, the church wasn't necessary to make it to heaven. Priests weren't necessary to make it to heaven. It's about having a relationship with God. And he has a huge impact on the Protestant Revolution because he is going to translate the Bible into English. Again, the Bible throughout the medieval times was only in Latin, and by translating things into these new vernaculars, this gives the non-Latin speaking masses access to the Bible. This is very similar to Xuanzang, the Chinese Buddhist monk that traveled to India and then brought back the Buddhist texts and translated them to Chinese. More protesters throughout Europe. Jan Hus from Bohemia. This is modern-day Czech Republic, Eastern Europe. He is going to lead a Protestant Reformation in his own country. The followers that followed him are called the Hussites. He is actually burned at the stake for heresy against the Catholic Church, as the Catholic Church often fought back with violence against these heretics, these people speaking out against them. And then Uldred Zwingli was another one. He starts the Swiss Reformation, and he says there's things that the church is doing that don't follow the exact teachings in the scriptures. Why is this disconnect occurring? Why is this controversy occurring? He also is labeled as a heretic. So the church is starting to label these Protestant reformers as enemies of the church. But if it had just been these reformers alone, perhaps the Catholic Church would have continued to dominate all of Europe. However, there are three Protestant reformers that are actually going to lead to the creation of our first Protestant churches. And of course, the big one being Martin Luther. Martin Luther is a monk from Wittenberg, which is at this time the Holy Roman Empire. Germany doesn't become a new country until the end of the 19th century, till the end of the 1800s. However, this Holy Roman Empire has always been deeply and devoutly Catholic. And Martin Luther is going to find some problems with his unwavering devotion to Catholicism because he visits Rome, which is supposed to be the holy city of Catholicism. And what he sees in Rome deeply upsets him. He sees corrupt practices being practiced by the Pope and by the bishops and by the church. And he particularly disliked two things: the sale of indulgences and simony. The sale of indulgences is where a person can literally purchase the absolution for their punishment for sin. So essentially, they've broken the law, they've broken God's word, they've sinned. If they donate money to the church and buy these indulgences, that they will be forgiven for these sins. That is what indulgences is. Martin Luther says there is nothing like this in the Bible, nothing close to this. I have a serious problem with this. The other thing is simony, selling of church offices. And in fact, the actual church, the actual Pope at this time is a man by the name of Leo X, who comes from the wealthy banking families of Italy. And so this is another example of where things have become corrupt in the church. And so Luther, he's not intending to create a revolution or to create a new church. He simply wants to point out the injustices that are occurring in these simple practices in the church. And by no means does he believe all of the Catholic Church is corrupt, but he does not like these particular practices. And so he's going to write a document called the 95 Theses, and he's going to nail it to his church door in Wittenberg, just this church door, in a small town of Germany. And little does he know that this is going to be mass produced with the Gutenberg printing press and then make its way throughout Europe, and thus create a sweeping tide of Protestantism, people protesting the Catholic Church. So with this 95 Thesis, he has challenged the Pope. He has challenged the very highest figure of the church. And he says the Bible should be listened to above the Pope. Well, the Pope, of course, is going to label him a heretic. And he says you have 120 days to come back to Rome and recant. And if not, that you are doomed to hell. And this scares Luther tremendously. But at the same time, he knows what he believes, and he continues to fight for his religious doctrines and what he believes. And so the Pope excommunicates him. And, that normally is that in history. And once you're excommunicated, nobody is going to follow you in Western Europe. You become, no one associates with you. And actually, this could lead to some serious economic problems if no one wants to buy your goods or sell you goods. But this isn't the case here with Martin Luther, that in fact, when he is excommunicated, actually many German political leaders are going to side with him, and they're going to side with him instead of siding with the church. And the reason being is that these political leaders seize on an opportunity. This is our opportunity, the German political leaders say, where we can finally remove ourselves from being under the church and put ourselves ahead of the church, above the church. This is the political thing we need to become completely sovereign in our German states. And with this, Luther is going to get a lot of political backing from many political leaders throughout the Holy Roman Empire. And he becomes a very key religious figure that people start to follow and look to as like a messiah. His followers are called Lutherans. And they are going to start the Lutheran Church. And Luther didn't want this. Again, he was not someone who was seeking power. In fact, when these German princes pledged their loyalty to him, he knew what they were doing. He knew they were doing this for their own political gain. And he actually didn't support these German princes when they rebelled against the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church. He called them out. He said, I know what you're doing, and this is for political gain. But nonetheless, a revolution has started, a Protestant Reformation, and new churches will be created. Now, anyone protesting the Catholic Church is called a Protestant. And if you're following one of these, religious leaders, you're following a particular derivation of Christianity, then you're going to be called either a Lutheran or a Calvinist or an Anglican, following one of these new denominations of Christianity. In this case, obviously Lutherans. And Lutherans had major impacts on women in Western Europe. Our Protestant religions, because it's all about having access directly with God and not having to go to church, that many women now are going to feel like they can have a direct access to God by studying the Bible. And so many women not only are going to study the Bible for the first time, they're also going to learn to read for the first time, become literate. So that's huge. But a negative side effect is that in the Catholic communities, that women could actually rise to the highest available power if they became nuns and they worked in convents, because of how much respect the Catholic Church had in Western Europe. And because convents weren't formed with our Protestant churches, we didn't have that level of upward mobility in our Protestant churches and our Protestant communities. Okay, the second of the Protestant reformers that's going to start their own church is John Calvin. John Calvin's from France, and he is a very, very serious and somber man. He believes that right from the very, very beginning, that God has chosen whether or not a soul will go to heaven or be damned to eternal damnation. And if you are, in fact, one of the lucky ones to be chosen right in conception to be going to heaven, that you are one of the elect, you are one of the chosen ones, the predestined. And because you are predestined, you have to show the rest of the world, the rest of your community, that you are a visible saint, that you are the chosen one. But how do you know whether you are predestined or not? That's the tricky part. And sometimes, you go most of your life not knowing if you were one of the predestined. And so you lived your life in fear and sadness, not knowing whether you were going to be one of the lucky ones. And so if you were chosen, that God was going to give you some sort of sign, what we call a spiritual conversion. You were going to feel this moment of godliness. And then from that moment on, that you were supposed to live your life as one of the elects. And you were supposed to work hard and show what a model Christian elect, visible saint is supposed to look like. And that's where the idea of the Protestant work ethic comes in, because you were supposed to show that you were one of God's chosen ones in society. And so many people, Calvinists, like our first people that came over across the Mayflower into New England, those are Calvinists, are going to come in and have a tremendously hard work ethic and a very devout outlook on life. Now, Calvinism is going to spread through parts of France. It's also going to spread over to Switzerland, as John Calvin was exiled from France and started a new kind of area of religion in Switzerland, Geneva. And if you followed John Calvin, then you were going to be a Calvinist. But if you were in France and you were any sort of person that was protesting against the Catholic Church, then you were a Huguenot, which is just the French word for Protestant. Okay, and then the last of our Protestant leaders is a man by the name of King Henry VIII, who everybody remembers. And, we just talked about the English Civil War, and the English Civil War happens, of course, after King Henry VIII. The English Civil War is in 1642 to 1651. So this is 100 years earlier. But we should know that this, what's going on here with King Henry VIII has a big influence over the events that happen in the English Civil War, because of King Henry VIII, the king becomes the religious leader of the Church of England. Now, of course, there isn't a Church of England before King Henry VIII. That would be a Protestant church. And King Henry VIII is going to start this Protestant church. Therefore, he is one of our great Protestant reformers. Ironically, not because he was a very devout person at all, but because he wanted a male heir. Everyone knows the story. He's married to Catherine of Aragon. They have 6 pregnancies. They have 1 daughter, 5 miscarriages, and no son. And so finally, King Henry is going to get very frustrated with Catherine, and he is going to go to the Pope to ask if the Pope can annul his marriage. And the Pope says, "No, I refuse to do so. This is not a godly decision. This is not what we do as Christians." And so because of this, the Pope refuses. And so King Henry VIII is going to remove himself from the Catholic Church and got approval from Parliament to create his own church, the Church of England, also called the Anglican Church. That makes England a heavy Protestant area protesting against the Catholic Church, which, of course, is the problem with all the way 100 years later with James II, who's Catholic, trying to become the King of England. And, of course, that doesn't make sense considering the Anglican Church is, in fact, a Protestant church. Okay, the Catholic Church is going to fight back with something called the Counter-Reformation. They don't like the fact that they're losing influence throughout Europe, that we have the creation of these Protestant churches and these Protestant reformers. And so they're going to fight back in 3 ways. And these 3 ways in their totality are called the Counter-Reformation. The first and the most famous is the Inquisition. which is I say a government agency. It's an agency of the church, but the church really is its own government that is going to seek out heretics, people that are speaking out against them, and try to fight back against them. And a lot of times, what they would use was fear, is that they would say either you are going to recant what you have said, take back what you have said, or you will face punishment. And oftentimes, that punishment could actually be torture. Trying to torture heretics so that they confess their sins and recant what they've said against the church. Two much more positive things from the Counter-Reformation were the creation of the Society of Jesus, who are Jesuits. They're formed by Ignatius of Loyola. And our Jesuits are going to send missionaries around the world looking to get converts. Of course, our Jesuits are going to have huge influence on world history because they're going to make their way over to Asia, for instance, into China during the Qing Dynasty, and over to Japan, which creates actually Japanese isolation with the Jesuits. And then the other thing is our Council of Trent. And in fact, it's not one council, it's actually about 25 meetings over 18 years. And this council is going to meet and talk about the interests of the Catholic Church and say, how can we continue to keep followers in the Catholic Church? One of the things they do, clarifying the church's doctrine and teaching, meaning getting rid of things like indulgences that were very unpopular. Another thing they did was publish the Index of Prohibited Books, which talks about all of these books that are banned. And one such example of a banned book, for instance, would be like John Calvin's book, The Institutes of Christian Religion. This is a banned book. You shouldn't read it. It's written by a heretic. So trying to combat the Protestant Revolution, that's the Counter-Reformation. Okay, if you look at this map in 1560, you can see really what this Protestant Reformation has done. The light yellow is Catholicism. And if we had looked at this map in 1400, it would all be yellow. Everything over here would be yellow. But you can see that there is a very divided map, and that's because we have these new Protestant religions that have been created. And when we look at where these religions are, it makes a ton of sense. So when you look at, for instance, Lutheranism, obviously that's started by Martin Luther. And you look at where is it? It's in the Holy Roman Empire. That's where the German states are, where he's from. And so this is going to have an impact on modern day Germany and the states around Germany. Eastern Orthodox Christianity, that would be things like Russian Orthodox, or down here where the Byzantine Empire used to be. That's where we're going to see Eastern Orthodox Christianity right there. Anglicanism, of course, that's the Church of England. So that's why England is heavily Anglican. And then when you look at France, of course, John Calvin was French. So you have some in France, and then also in Switzerland, where you see he moved and created his own religious society there. So Protestant Reformation and the effects. And so now with all these different religions, you're going to have religious wars. And there's two examples that we need to discuss. And one of which is in the Holy Roman Empire. We have these new German Lutheran princes that are going to be fighting in the name of Catholicism. And we are going to have a battle on our hands. Our Holy Roman Emperor and the ruler of the Spanish Empire. So we've got a guy that's ruling over modern day Germany and Austria and Spain. This is a very powerful man by the name of Charles V. And he is going to have to fight against some German Lutheran princes, so the ones that are supporting Luther, and they're called the Schmalkaldic League, and he is going to be fighting in the name of Catholicism. And so we have this battle going on between these two sides, and the effect is something called the Peace of Augsburg. And the Peace of Augsburg says that each German state within the Holy Roman Empire can choose whether they want to be Protestant or Catholic. Now, this is a huge victory for Protestantism, because previously the Holy Roman Empire had been entirely Catholic. And now each German state can confirm what religion they want to practice. So Protestantism has won out here. And Charles V, so disappointed that he couldn't protect Catholic interests, is going to resign and leave his throne and leave his son, Philip II, to rule Spain. And Philip II is another very important person, because Philip II is a devout Catholic, and he is going to try and spread Catholicism and halt the spread of Protestantism. This guy is important in a lot of different levels. For one, he's the guy that sent out Magellan to circumnavigate the globe, who eventually finds the Philippines. The Philippines are named after this guy, Philip II of Spain. Another thing that he does is come over to the Netherlands and conquer the Netherlands and trying to force them to become Catholic. And then, not on this slide, he actually also allies with Venice and fights the Ottomans in the Mediterranean Sea and wins the Battle of Lepanto, which wins the Mediterranean for the Catholics and defeats the Muslims there. He's also then going to try and invade England. England, of course, is Anglican. They're a Protestant church. He tries to invade England with what was called at the time the unbeatable Spanish Armada. We have all of this wealth flowing into Spain from the New World. And so we have all of this Spanish silver being spent on these big, heavy warships. And they come in and try to defeat the English. And the English have these smaller, lighter ships that are more effective against the Spanish Armada. And then the other thing that occurs is a huge storm comes into the English Channel and wrecks a large majority of the Spanish fleet. To this day, the English call this the Protestant wind. This is God protecting the English from the Catholics in this case. Regardless, Philip II of Spain, unsuccessful at conquering England. And the other side effect of this invasion, of attempted invasion of England, is that England, from this point forward, has the most powerful navy in the world, all the way throughout the rest of our course. Okay, in France, we have a division because of John Calvin. John Calvin inspired lots of Huguenots, which are French Protestants. And so we have civil war in our hands. We have a religious war, Huguenots fighting Catholics. And then King Henry IV, or Henry of Navarre, takes the throne. And Henry of Navarre was born as a Protestant. He was raised as a Protestant, but he realizes that most of his country is Catholic. And so with the very famous saying that Paris is well worth a mass, this guy is going to convert to Catholicism to help unite his country. And to protect Protestants or Huguenots within France, he issues the Edict of Nantes, which gives religious tolerance to Huguenots. France is given peace for 87 years. It's only until Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, revokes the Edict of Nantes do we start religious conflict again in France. But the biggest example of religious war in Europe, and this is all of Europe, is the 30 Years' War. This is the biggest religious war in the history of Europe. 8 million people are going to die in this war. So we're talking about heavy, heavy casualties. And this is fought all throughout Europe. Catholics versus Protestants. Troops on both sides are going to engage in some very ungodly activities, looting and pillaging, those sort of things. And the immediate effect is that Europe is going to be hit with a series of famine and starvation and disease. Nasty, nasty stuff. It really ends in a stalemate. There is no victory here. But it is the treaty, the Peace of Westphalia, is in fact a treaty for Protestantism. And in fact, anything but a return to the pre-war period would have been a victory for Protestantism, because previously we had seen, the Catholic Church dominating Western Europe. And so now with the Peace of Westphalia, we see that each area of the Holy Roman Empire could pick between Catholicism, Lutheranism, or Calvinism. And we see the rest of Western Europe really choosing which religion they're going to be. France, Spain, and Italy, closest to Rome, are going to remain Catholic. Northern Europe is going to be either Lutheran or Calvinism, and then England, of course, is going to be Anglican. The big effect of the 30 Years' War is that the Catholic Church has lost power. They have lost influence over half the states in Europe, and this opens up the opportunity for political leaders to gain power, which we talked about earlier in this lecture. Our last two slides. With the decline of the influence of the church, we see the influence of scientific thinking. And this is going to start something called the scientific revolution. And the scientific revolution is going to lead right in and intersect with the Enlightenment, which of course is this new idea of thinking that human beings have the ability to reason and think for themselves and don't have to accept the dogma of the church as the correct way of looking at the world. And so Francis Bacon, he's often called the father of the scientific method because he develops empiricism, which is the idea that, yes, if you have an hypothesis about why something is the way that it is, that you should collect data and challenge this hypothesis with experiments. This is going to start our modern scientific method, and we are going to see tons of experiments being conducted to explain some of the world's biggest mysteries. We see physicists like Isaac Newton come in and demonstrate that gravity, and we have people like Galileo that proves that the earth revolves around the sun. And this is a major development here because the church had always said that the planet was the center of the universe. And so because of this, we see once again a weakening of the influence of the church. Newton, as I mentioned, adds to Galileo's work, and he's going to publish a book called Principia, which is going to talk about gravity and gravitational pull. Science is going to show that the world is ordered and rational and lead right into the Age of Enlightenment in our next unit in Europe. So the partner DBQ, the creation of land-based empires in Eurasia brought new administrative challenges. Analyze the way in which Eurasian states ruled their subjects between 1450 and 1750. Document 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, guys, that is it for this unit, Unit 3. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I look forward to reading your work and seeing you guys shortly in our next Zoom meeting. All right, guys, talk to you soon. Bye.